Today, we're looking at how the Siege of Orléans actually unfolded, not as a legend, not as a miracle, but as a siege that was supposed to end quietly, and didn't. We're going to see why the English believed time was enough to win, why the city never fully collapsed despite months under pressure, how the siege slowly settled into a false sense of inevitability. We'll follow how Orléans held on while waiting seemed like the only option, how English positions were built to contain, not to fight, and how that assumption shaped every decision outside the walls. Then we'll look at the moment everything changed, when Joan of Arc entered the city, not to bring overwhelming force, but to change behavior, urgency, and tempo. We'll see how the siege stopped being static, how English bastilles began to fall, and why the retreat that followed wasn't a collapse in battle, but the failure of a plan built entirely on waiting. This is the Siege of Orléans, and this is how time stopped working. Chapter 1. The Illusion of Control. England did not come to Orléans seeking a decisive battle. It came seeking Touraine. In 1428, Orléans stood as the last major obstacle on the Loire River. Its position made it a gate between northern and southern France. If the city fell, English forces would gain a clear route south and consolidate years of territorial gains. But the plan was not urgency. It was patience. Rather than storming the walls, the English command chose containment. Orléans did not need to be taken quickly. It only needed to be isolated, pressured, and left to exhaust itself. From the outside, the situation appeared controlled. The city was surrounded, supplies were strained, relief was uncertain. To English commanders, Orléans already looked like a problem that had been solved, just not yet concluded. Chapter 2. The Incomplete Encirclement. The Siege of Orléans was never airtight. English forces built a ring of fortified positions, bastilles, around the city. These strong points dominated roads, crossings, and approaches. On land, movement became dangerous. On paper, Orléans appeared cut off, but the Loire River remained a vulnerability. The river was not fully sealed. Boats continued to move along its course. Messages crossed. Supplies, though limited and irregular, still entered the city. The siege reduced Orléans' strength, but it did not suffocate it. This flaw was not unknown to the English. It was tolerated. The assumption was simple. Even an imperfect siege would succeed given enough time. Hunger would do what weapons did not. Morale would collapse on its own. The English did not need control everywhere. They only needed control long enough. Chapter 3. Orléans as the key to the Loire. Orléans was not just another city under siege. Its location made it strategically decisive. The Loire River was a lifeline, a route of movement and supply. Holding Orléans meant controlling that artery. Losing it meant halting expansion and exposing English positions further north. For England, Orléans represented momentum. For France, it represented survival. Inside the city, conditions worsened steadily. Food shortages grew. Civilians and soldiers alike understood the stakes, but saw few options. Orléans was not preparing for victory. It was preparing to endure. From the outside, English commanders observed a city slowly grinding down. From the inside, Orléans felt increasingly isolated and forgotten. Both sides believed time was passing, but only one side believed it truly mattered. Chapter 4. The False Calm. As weeks turned into months, the siege settled into routine. No major French relief army appeared. No large counteroffensive challenged the English positions. The city remained contained behind its walls. This lack of resistance created a dangerous illusion. English bastilles became static garrisons rather than active components of a living siege. Commanders rotated duties. The urgency of the early campaign faded. What had begun as a military operation began to feel like an administrative process. The silence from the city was misread as submission. The absence of action was mistaken for weakness. In reality, the siege was stagnating, but stagnation was interpreted as success. Chapter 5. The Sealed Error. At some point, without a single order being issued, the English crossed a line. They stopped questioning whether the situation could change. The siege was treated as irreversible. Orléans was no longer viewed as an opponent capable of initiative. It was viewed as a problem already solved by time. This was not a failure of resources. It was not a failure of planning. It was a failure of assumption. England believed that endurance equaled control, that waiting itself was a form of victory. And once that belief set in, adaptability disappeared. The siege became rigid, and rigidity invites rupture. Chapter 6. The Arrival of Joan. When Joan of Arc entered Orléans in 1429, the balance of power did not suddenly shift. There was no massive reinforcement. No overwhelming force appeared at the gates. What changed was not strength, but behavior. Inside the city, hesitation ended. Decisions were made rapidly. Waiting was rejected. Where caution had ruled, urgency took its place. Joan did not alter the material conditions of the siege. She altered how the city responded to them. Orléans stopped enduring. It began acting. Chapter 7. The Change of Tempo. The English had planned for months. The French now operated in days. Attacks were launched against individual bastilles with speed and purpose. The goal was not a grand engagement, but disruption. Pressure replaced patience. This shift in tempo caught the English system unprepared. The siege had been designed for stillness. Bastilles were positioned to contain, not to withstand repeated assaults. Once forced into constant reaction, coordination weakened. Time, which England had assumed was theirs alone, became contested. And once time is contested, control evaporates. Chapter 8. The Fall of the Bastilles. One by one, English positions came under sustained attack. These bastilles depended on the broader siege system to function. Isolated, they were vulnerable. Reinforcements moved slowly. Communication faltered. Defensive depth was shallow. The French did not need to defeat the entire English force. They only needed to fracture the system holding it together. Each lost position increased pressure on the next. Momentum built rapidly. What had once seemed permanent now felt unstable. The siege line did not collapse all at once. It unraveled. Chapter 9. The Withdrawal. The English withdrawal from Orléans was not a catastrophic battlefield defeat. There was no final decisive engagement, no dramatic annihilation. Instead, there was recognition. The original strategy no longer functioned. The siege could not be restored to its former state. Endurance, the core of the plan, had been broken. Holding positions now required constant reaction. Waiting was no longer possible. And without the ability to wait, the English plan had nothing left. The siege was abandoned. Chapter 10. The Lesson of Orléans. England did not lose Orléans because it lacked soldiers. It did not lose because its fortifications failed. It lost because it believed time was a permanent ally. The siege worked until it was forced to move. Stability existed until it was challenged. Orléans did not survive because it became stronger. It survived because waiting stopped being acceptable. The moment the siege became dynamic, England lost the advantage it had been counting on. The error was not tactical, it was temporal. And by the time England realized that time no longer belonged to them, Orléans was already free.